You might be wondering, why is someone from the Sierra Club talking to you about trade? And the answer is that there's a significant environmental component to this particular agreement, and even the investment chapter would have a significant impact on our ability to implement laws and regulations related to the environment. So I want to start out by talking about two things. First, I want to talk a little bit about just the general structure of the how this agreement came to be, and just a little more specific with a highlighted example. So this is, we heard from the previous speaker about how the regular citizens like us were kept out of the process of the negotiation, as well as Congress, but all of these corporations were given a seat at the table. So I wanted to give you an example of some of the energy advisors. You'll note the Sierra Club, the Delaware Riverkeeper Network, and Food and Water Watch are clearly absent. I'm sure that was an oversight. But Chevron, Halliburton, the National Coal Council, and the like were included. So this sort of gives you a sense of how this all came to be and whose interests are really represented by this agreement. And then, so with the environmental chapter, I'm going to talk about two of the chapters that were leaked. First, the environmental chapter, and second, the investment chapter. And one of the serious concerns that we have as the Sierra Club is the environmental implications of the possibility of increasing illegal trade. So in the Pacific Rim, there are some pretty significant issues related to illegal logging, as well as illegally taken wildlife parks. So I have hopefully a not too graphic picture of some tiger parks up in this corner. And then also shark finning, which has been a significant issue. And I've spared you some of the graphic pictures of shark finning. But one of the points that I want to make, in addition to the fact that expanding trade could expand many of these illegal practices, is that the environmental chapter is really just a nod to the fact that there are environmental consequences to trade, but it's completely toothless because it's not enforceable. So other chapters are enforceable, but the environmental chapter does not have any of those mechanisms built into it. So one of the things we're concerned about are, opportunities to include real enforceable restrictions on timber industry, the shark finning, and other practices are just not there. And so we're not seeing the ability to adequately regulate the environmental concerns that are associated with this expanded trade. And so next, moving into the investment chapter, and this was also referred to under NAFTA with the Chapter 11 issue. And here, what we've been referring to it as is investor-state dispute resolution. And as I said, this chapter has some really strong legally binding mechanisms for enforcement, which is very dissimilar to the environmental chapter. So we have the ability of investors, so the corporation has investors behind it, shareholders, and they're elevated to the same level as all of us based on our position as citizens and our representation in all levels of government. So not just at the congressional level, but also each state. So Pennsylvania is now given the same level of treatment as investors in Chevron. And so one of the other things I just wanted to mention is that this mechanism isn't something that actually is associated with an increased interest in investing in foreign countries. So this isn't a mechanism that is required to attract foreign investors. It's just kind of an added handout because the people who were involved in forming this policy are really just looking out for their own best interests. again, this really is democracy in crisis, and I think that that's one of the fundamental issues, and when democracy breaks down, so does our ability to protect the environment. So what this, basically, the foreign corporations, through this investor-state dispute resolution provision, would be allowed to attack almost any law or policy that they can argue would have a limit on their expected future profits. And like I said, it's not just national laws, but it would be things like if Pennsylvania were to enact a ban or a moratorium on fracking, then that's something that could then be challenged through this legal mechanism and not in a Pennsylvania court. So it would considerably hamstring our ability to create a regulatory environment that is at all meaningful. And so the cases, again, aren't heard in the courts of the country that they're brought in. There's actually, some people have referred to it as a kangaroo court. Also, you know, the more sort of accurate term is a private tribunal. And there are 3 private lawyers who are appointed, and it basically is just a way of completely subverting any kind of democratic court system. And we've seen already under NAFTA that there are 500 cases against 90 governments. So companies including ExxonMobil, Dow Chemical, and similar have brought significant attacks on governments already, and this would just be an expansion of that. So it's not that this is something that we're just saying, oh, this is something to be concerned about in theory. It's actually something to really be concerned about. And I wanted to use a concrete example, and again, because TPP hasn't had, and hopefully never will have, the history that NAFTA does, this example comes from NAFTA, comes out of NAFTA, but is actually something that we could just as easily see under TPP. So this is Lone Pine Resources versus the Government of Canada. And what happened here is pretty unbelievable, but is actually true, and we would see a lot more of this happen if TPP were to go through. So this was Quebec fighting against fracking, and you can imagine that we may have reason to be in a similar position. So there was a proposal to do natural gas development under the St. Lawrence River in Canada, and the citizens of Quebec said, wait a second, we're really concerned about the fact that you want to extract natural gas from under one of our most significant waterways. So why don't we call for a moratorium? We'll wait, we'll see at least if we can evaluate the impacts before we let this go forward. And they were lucky enough to be able to have the Quebec National Assembly actually call for that moratorium. And that, I mean, as we know from all of the work we've been doing in Pennsylvania, that's not an easy feat. To get your government to recognize your interests to the point where they're willing to put economic interests on hold takes a significant amount of work and is really an achievement of democracy. And then here we go, Lone Pine Resources comes in and they say, I don't think so, Canada. You are infringing on my right to make profits off of this under NAFTA. And actually, the right that they claimed in their notice of intent to sue was the right to mine. So this is basically a corporate right to mine or to profit off of mining, taking precedent over the National Assembly of Quebec enacting a moratorium. So, and I should say that the notice to sue was for $250 million. So that when you're then put governments in the position to have to anticipate threat of lawsuit for those significant figures, it puts an added dynamic into the policy making. So when you know that not only are you facing domestic opposition or domestic companies undermining your ability to fight for clean air, clean water, the integrity of the environment. Now you're also facing foreign investors who are armed with these legal mechanisms to actually come after you as a government for doing your job. And I wanted to take out, just because it is so unbelievable, unless you have been kind of dealing with the aftermath of NAFTA on a daily basis or anticipating TPP, but this is actual language from the Notice of Intent to Sue. So Lone Pine was claiming that the acts of the Canadian government by enacting a moratorium on fracking under the St. Lawrence River was arbitrary, capricious, and illegal revocation of Lone Pine's valuable right to mine for oil and gas under the St. Lawrence River without due process, compensation, and with no cognizable public purpose. So this is basically saying your public purpose of trying to protect Quebec from the unknown threats of fracking under the St. Lawrence River are not as valuable a right as our right to mine for oil and gas under that same waterway. And so one of the concerns is if we expand this into the Pacific Rim through the Trans Pacific Partnership, then we're just continually exposing ourselves to more threats of similar notices of intent to sue our government. So we know how hard it is to struggle with government, to get good policies, and then to have those undermined by foreign investors, I think is a real concern and certainly democracy in crisis. So ultimately what we're dealing with is now not only trade, but really governance. So do we want our countries to have the right to govern themselves, or do we want corporate interests to just have this unlimited right to profit? And just to reiterate, like I said, this is a very real problem. This is not theoretical, even though it sounds completely unbelievable. But there have been hundreds of cases in tens of governments brought through these provisions. So it's not a question of whether we will encounter these kind of suits under TPP. It's just when and against whom. And I really do think that it's great that you're all here, because so much of the negotiating happened in secret, that the more we can really talk about the on-the-ground, real-world impact that these provisions would have, I think the more successful we'll be in helping to stop this process before it just bowls us over.
Hi. So great to be here. Thank you so much. Again, I'm Maya Van Rossum. I'm the Delaware Riverkeeper. My organization is the Delaware Riverkeeper Network, and we work throughout the entire Delaware River watershed, top to bottom, side to side, including New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, and fighting to protect Delaware from any and all threats that it faces. And that is why, like with the Sierra Club and Food and Water Watch and other environmental organizations, we are increasingly involved with this issue of the Trans Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement, because it affects our environment and it threatens our river in many, many ways, seen and unseen. Most of them unseen, because it's all being done in secret, except what's been leaked, as you've heard tonight. So we're not really focusing on the environment chapter, which we are only aware of in terms of its content because it was leaked through WikiLeaks. We're not really talking about that because the fact of the matter is it doesn't really do anything to protect our environment. It gives a nod to a few critical issues like the logging issue, the overfishing issue, the finning issue for the sharks. It gives a nod to global climate change, but it uses very flowery language which talks about information sharing and recognizing each other's discretionary rights to prosecute or not prosecute for the environment. It has a whole lot of language which does a whole lot of nothing in terms of protecting the environment. And in fact, if there is a violation, a perceived violation of the environment chapter, as weak as it is, the only enforcement mechanism is for there to be an analysis by a tribunal, and they do a review, and they write a report, and they make recommendations. And if the recommendations aren't followed, then countries can write nasty letters to one another, I suppose. But they don't really, there's nothing like the investment state dispute resolution provision that Joanne talked about. It's very loose. So The Environment Chapter does a whole lot of nothing in terms of protecting the environment, but the other provisions in the Trans Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement do a whole lot of something in terms of threatening the environment. Now, you heard about the ISDR provisions. I'm going to talk a little bit about the implications for shale gas development. And I'm going to begin with the issue of exportation of liquefied natural gas. Right? So the provisions in the investment chapter of the TPP put in place provisions necessary to make LNG a whole heck of a lot easier. And if you make LNG exports easier, then it means you're going to have more pressure to engage in shale gas development, in drilling, in fracking, and all the infrastructure associated with it. How does this happen? It's a little bit complicated, and so you're going to see some language. And the point of putting the language up is not that I like to put words on the screen, but I want you to see that we're talking about actual U.S. laws that are being implicated through the Trans Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement, and how that works to allow LNG to happen more easily. But the Natural Gas Act that we have here in the United States, it prohibits the import or export of natural gas, including liquefied natural gas, to or from any foreign country, unless you've gotten Department of Energy approval. So that sounds really good, right? And in order to receive that approval, Department of Energy approval, generally, you would have to have an environmental impact statement. You'd have to have an analysis of economic and environmental impacts. And there has to be a determination by the Department of Energy that import or export of gas, of liquefied natural gas, is in the public interest. Right? It's not going to be in the public interest if it harms our environment, if it harms our economy, if it harms our communities. Right? So that sounds really lovely, that the Natural Gas Act is protecting us. But the Natural Gas Act goes on. And what the Natural Gas Act goes on to say is that the Department of Energy must deem as being consistent with the public interest applications that authorize the export of natural gas to nations which have entered into a free trade agreement with the United States requiring national treatment for trade in natural gas. That's the language, right? And what will, once you have, right, you have an application to do export to one of these free trade agreement nations, not only does the Department of Energy deem that exportation to be in the public interest, but it is instructed by the law to grant authorization without modification or delay. So the company gets to put in their application saying that they want to export to a free trade agreement nation. The Department of Energy must say that is in the public interest. Here you go. Your application is approved. Post haste.
Wow.
Under the Trans Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement, it is our expectation, with the language that's been leaked and what we know about the TPP, is that the nations that sign on to it will be these free trade agreement nations. It will have the requisite language so that the applications for LNG export will be deemed to be in the public interest and have to be granted without delay and without modification. Now, this is the list of countries that currently have that FTA designation, right? So for whom things are deemed in the public interest. If the TPP is passed, these are the additional countries that will get added to that list. Amongst them will probably be China. China isn't officially part of the TPP now, but it is expected to be signing on very, very soon. The other thing is that the TPP is being written and crafted as what's known as a docking agreement. So even though a country does not agree to the TPP at the time it is formed and signed by everybody, if a country comes along and says, hey, we agree to comply with the provisions of the TPP, we want to sign on the dotted line, they automatically get added to the list. So they automatically become part of the TPP. They automatically, in this country, get that FTA designation, and they get any LNG export applications to those countries deemed in the public interest, granted without modification or delay. In front of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, we have a growing number of applications for LNG export. And when you look at this list, you will see that there are 13 applications for approvals for export, and there are 8 projects that industry has decided are good potential projects for LNG exports. So, and FERC sort of agrees with them that they're good projects or prospects, so much so that they've been included on this official FERC list, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission list of potential LNG export facilities for the near future coming down the pipe. If you take just those 21 projects, and they were all to be given approval, 43% of the gas that is produced in the United States each year would be exported by those 21 facilities. So, when you pump up the pressure for LNG exports, you're pumping up the pressure for fracking, for drilling, for shale gas development, right? So we're going to have more LNG because it's going to be easier to get approvals, more fracking, more drilling, more gas going overseas, not staying here. You've heard of, so that right there, right? That's dramatically changing the picture for shale gas development. But you've, on top of that, heard about the interstate dispute resolution provisions, which can be used, which will be used, to undermine laws that are passed. So if you've got a ban on fracking in a New York State community, like you have now, you might have a foreign corporation suing the United States, asking for $250 million or more, because that ban has impeded their ability to earn profits from the leases that they might hold in that town, which will result in 2 things. If they win, the United States, we the taxpayers, are going to have to pay those hundreds of millions of dollars to that foreign corporation who sued us. But it also means that that local law isn't in compliance with the TPP. It's undermining the TPP. So chances are that local law goes away. The other thing that will happen, right, in the United States, we have a lot of great environmental provisions, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act. These laws are designed to force enhancements in technology, to make corporations have to reach to do it better, to reduce their environmental footprint if they want to get a permit in order to operate in our country. Now, do you think that a state or even the federal government is going to be likely to start passing stronger and stronger regulations that require a corporation to reach to do it better in terms of protecting our environment if it means that a foreign corporation is going to be able to bring a lawsuit that says, you've made it harder for me to earn my profits, I sue you, pay me hundreds of millions of dollars? No. So you're going to have a chilling effect on the passage of new environmental protection laws that science and experience and good public policy have demonstrated are necessary for protecting our environment and protecting our communities. So you're going to undermine laws that are in place, and you're going to put in place a chilling effect on the creation of new laws. So you're going to have a dramatic weakening of laws. Now, when it comes to shale gas development is such a threat to our environment, to present and future generations, that the conservative Supreme Court issued a ruling in December that said a piece of pro-drilling legislation called Act 13 should in large part be declared unconstitutional, or at least provisions of it should be revisited. And I'm very proud to say that the only environmental organization that pursued this litigation, that won this lawsuit with the 7 counts, was the Delaware Riverkeeper Network. So we take very seriously the import of protecting our communities from shale gas development. And just to highlight, it's a big deal that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court came back and said, we need to protect our communities from fracking. And they used very dramatic language in the decision, like the techniques that are engaged in shale gas development will inevitably do violence to the landscape. Violence to the landscape. That they're going to impact our life, our health, our liberty. that they will have a lasting and undeniably detrimental impact. The natural gas industry will have a lasting and undeniably detrimental impact for present generations and future generations. And as a result, the court said that the Pro-Drilling Act 13 law, which was such a gift to the drilling industry and going to really grease the wheels for more drilling, more fracking, was not okay. So we can see in terms of the TPP, as we grease the wheels by making it easier for LNG exports, by weakening our environmental protection laws in this country, we are knowingly going to do damage to ourselves, to our earth, to our environment, and to future generations. And you know what? Our state governments know it, and our federal government better know it, because they should know about this law. And yet they're still going forward with the TPP. So with that, I will pass it on so that you can hear about the food safety implications of the Trans Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement.
So Trans Pacific Partnership represents a huge threat to our country's food system. It threatens the safety of the food we eat and the water that we drink. And so Food and Water Watch is an organization that, that works to keep our food safe, accessible, and affordable. That's one of the main reasons that we want to be involved in making sure that TPP is not passed. So a lot of the initiatives that we work on, stuff like labeling genetically engineered food or banning antibiotics in animal feed, these are things that wouldn't be possible in a world where TPP was a reality. So like preceding trade deals, TPP would take down trade barriers, and one of the areas where trade barriers exist is our food economy. So how would this deal affect our food economy? Well, when we hear trade barriers, TPP views food safety standards themselves as barriers to food trade. So negotiators are looking to undermine our food safety rules that would keep dangerous and bad food out of American markets. So TPP would require the import of, would require us to allow the import of meat and poultry and seafood that do not currently meet U.S. food safety standards. So under TPP, any U.S. safety rule on pesticides, on labeling or additives that's higher than the sort of lowest common denominator of international food safety standards would be subject to challenge as an international trade barrier. And the countries that we're talking about, Vietnam and Thailand, they don't have the same food safety standards that we do in America. And we don't have the inspectors at our regulatory agencies to make sure that the food that's coming in is okay on our end. So they're not checking it on their end. We don't have the capacity to check it on our end. So an example of that is in 2010, the FDA had 92 full-time border inspectors inspecting food safety. And that means that in that year, each border inspector was responsible for inspecting 56.5 million pounds of seafood just in that year. So, you know, if we were to take down trade barriers and allow for more seafood to be coming into our country, we would be even more overwhelmed, and we would have even less of an ability to make sure that the food that is that we're buying and putting in our bodies is safe. So what does this mean about the food that we're eating? What exactly are the health hazards that we're talking about? So Representative Rosa DeLauro is one of the main advocates speaking out against TPP, and she explained in a letter that some of the risks are the transshipment of tainted Chinese shrimp through Malaysia. So China is not a signatory of TPP right now. We don't want Chinese seafood coming into our country, but they can very easily route it through. a TPP signatory country. There are also examples of the continued presence of banned antibiotics in Vietnamese seafood imports. Now, we've got a lot of antibiotics in our own food system, but we don't allow a lot of antibiotics that are commonly used in foreign countries because there's a clear health risk to them. Some TPP signatory countries, like Vietnam in this example, use those dangerous antibiotics in cultivating their seafood. So why does this matter? Well, the decrease in food safety standards means an increase in foodborne illness. We're living in a world where more and more, every year we're seeing more and more foodborne illness, and we're seeing more bugs that are resistant to the antibiotics that we have available. So it's really important that we are able to maintain the standard of food safety that we have in our country right now. So the other two items that I want to talk about, so I just talked about food safety. I also want to briefly touch on how this would impact our food economies and the general idea of food sovereignty. So TPP would impact our food economy by pushing out competitors, domestic competitors. So the influx of that seafood that we're talking about would further push domestic seafood producers out of profitability and out of our American market. So this chart's got the percentage of our national seafood market that's being imported by current TPP signatory countries. If TPP were actualized, you'd see all of these numbers skyrocket. And what that would mean for our food economies, well, these numbers represent a market increase in historic numbers. And we've got a seafood industry specifically in the Gulf that has, I'm sure you're all aware, has seen better days after a huge oil spill in the Gulf. And on top of the environmental travesties that have happened in the Gulf, the influx of seafood has meant in the past decade we've lost 22,000 seafood-related jobs in the Mississippi Delta. If TPP were actualized, we would see essentially our seafood industry in America just decimated, and pretty much it would just wither and go away. And the last thing that I want to talk about is food sovereignty. So to define food sovereignty, it's the principle that people have the right to define their own food systems, placing the individuals who produce and consume food at the center of food policy decisions. We know that trade deals bump up against this principle. We saw this with NAFTA, which I think Phyla referred to, the influx of cheap American corn under NAFTA into Mexico led to the forcing out of Mexican farmers off their land who just simply couldn't compete with the drop in prices of corn in Mexico. All of those farmers, or a lot of them at least, migrated north looking for jobs, and now we have the immigration problem that are facing in our country today. So that's an example of what NAFTA did to Mexico, and we would see a similar economic phenomena occur in a bunch of TPP countries were this deal to be actualized. So one example is Japanese rice farmers who run very labor-intensive operations in Japan to produce rice that they view as sort of a national treasure. And it's not as cheap as rice that's produced in other countries, but they value it. The farmers value it, the consumers value it. these farmers are very afraid that under TPP they would be pushed out of existence by the influx of foreign rice into their country. So that's how a TPP would impact our food safety, our food economies, and food sovereignty.
So from research and leaks, including WikiLeaks, we really do know quite a bit of what is in the TPP. It includes the NAFTA Chapter 11 investor rights, which would give 14,000 foreign corporations the right to sue the federal government to basically undo any regulation that they claim threatened their expected profits. Vietnam is one of the partner countries. Vietnam is a notorious human rights violator. The minimum wage in Vietnam is 28 cents an hour, and the TPP would put our workers in competition with these Vietnamese sweatshops, causing more offshoring of jobs and further downward pressure on wages. Other speakers will be talking about food safety. TPP would ban Buy American policies. Governments are huge purchasers of goods and services. And Buy American policies require governments to purchase U.S.-made or contract to provide jobs for U.S. workers. And, you know, these would be banned by the TPP. One thing that I'm particularly concerned about is the area of finance. TPP would prevent effective regulation of Wall Street, expose new Wall Street regulations to challenge and roll back, jeopardizing bans on risky financial products and services, too big to fail regulations, financial transaction tax. Now, one thing that we know about is that capital controls will be essentially prohibited by TPP. And it's this movement of global capital that is the cause of the job insecurity. In the absence of capital controls, global capital, known as, in some cases hot money, surges into countries and can surge out overnight, destroying economies. The Asian crisis in 1997 was due to this, and it's being replayed today. You know, the Federal Reserve's quantitative easing was supposed to pump up our economy. Instead, the investment was overseas, and with the Fed's taper, now capital surging out of emerging markets and causing crises in those countries. Also, this week the Fed imposed higher reserve requirements on foreign banks operating in the U.S. This was to avoid a repeat of the 2009 $500 billion Fed bailout of foreign banks. This is threatened by TPP. And it's the uncontrolled capital movement. That's the reason why it's a war of all against all among nations, communities, to offer the most business-friendly sites for global investment, the cheapest, the most deregulated. And, I want to conclude the, TPP, as you can see, is a colossal handover of rights and resources to multinational corporations. And then there's fast track. This is a procedure which was first devised in the Nixon administration to circumvent normal congressional legislative procedures for trade deals. It last expired in 2007, but now President Obama has requested renewal of fast track, and a bill has been introduced, the Camp-Baucus bill. And if fast track is approved, TPP will be approved. To stop TPP, we must stop fast track. Now, Sam is telling me the clock is running, but I want to quickly tell you that fast track is a piece of legislation that the Congress passes in normal procedure. But what it does is once that is in place, the president negotiates the trade agreement, signs it, writes the implementing legislation for all the domestic law that is changed by the trade agreement, and only then does the Congress even see the documents of the trade agreement and all the domestic policy that must be changed by that. And, only then do the media public see this thing. Then it is rammed through Congress with only 20 hours of debate, no amendments, up or down vote. This is a, legislation and instrument that has sweeping impact on our domestic policy and future, and it's just ran through, like a blank check. And it can't be changed. All other parts of the countries have to agree. So unlike any other legislation that we have, it can't be repealed. So, 1 minute. Okay, so I'm going to give you my final wrap. And this is the thing that really drives me. It is a very serious threat to our democratic institutions and national sovereignty. For TPP, the Congress's exclusive constitutional role to set trade policy is usurped by multinational corporate figures conducting secret negotiations that involve massive revision of duly enacted domestic policy. As I repeated, NAFTA-style trade agreements enable global corporations to blackmail communities and nations into accepting low wages and deregulation in exchange for the privilege of getting their investment. And this is in addition to enticements such as infrastructure and low or no taxes. And you'll hear more about the NAFTA Chapter 11 investor rights, but TPP overrides Congress's legislative authority, and fast track overrides Congress's proper authority to act on TPP. They're instruments of global corporate seizure of vital functions of our constitutional democracy, a process that is well underway with the NAFTA WTO model, and which is destroying the middle class, environment, and food safety in this country.